rather too long, born and bred in Huddersfield, and rather too long a business person, sort of out and about in the Huddersfield region. Originally a lawyer, but now doing media and PR and working with public groups. So just a little bit of a background around the Sustainable Huddersfield Group before we get into our guest speakers to talk in a little bit more detail. So the question I always ask is, what would it mean to people in Huddersfield and to the businesses and the locality and people within the Huddersfield region if it were to become a sustainable town? So imagine a thriving, healthy community where residents lead fulfilled lives and so on, a place where natural environment is protected and tackling climate change is a priority. A town, as much as anything, full of pioneers, responsible businesses and opportunities for young people. What we want to do in our Sustainable Huddersfield Group is we'd like this project that we've got to actually start a conversation between a number of stakeholder groups. So local residents, activists, students, of course, business people, people who are frontline workers, policymakers, people who are coming together to share ideas and concerns. And what we want as much as anything is we want our town to become greener, stronger, and we want to ensure that no one's left behind. Now, to do that, what we've got is we've aligned ourselves with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of those in total, but of course we can't deal with them all at once, especially as we're starting our group at the moment and as we're fairly sort of new into the group itself. So what we've done is we've identified 6 principal priority goals within our group. The first one is good health and well-being, and then quality education. Affordable and clean energy is the third one. The fourth is sustainable cities and communities, and then responsible consumption and production, and then finally climate action as well. In order to address those 6 particular goals, we've got within our Sustainable Huddersfield Town group, we've got 5 principal working parties, and these are chaired by sort of business people, activists and specialists and so on. And in fact, I'm honored to be one of the chairs of one of the particular groups. So we've got business and manufacturing, and we will be coming to Bill Macbeth, who's joint chair of that, a little bit later on in this presentation. We've got environment, we've got transport and energy, health and well-being, and the one that I'm chair of, which is communications and culture. So we've got this afternoon a great mix of fabulous speakers to go through quite a number of things that are of particular interest and particular relevance. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll introduce everybody together, and then we'll move on as we move forward. So first of all, I've got Dr. Beth Perry from the University of Sheffield. So Beth's a fellow at the Sheffield University Urban Institute, and her research there focuses on developing pathways to more just and sustainable urban futures. So over the last decade, Beth has been the UK program lead for the Mistra Urban Futures Centre, and she's currently working on their Realising Just Cities initiative. Next, I've got Allan Macloed from Bristol One City. Allan's leading on Sustainable Development Goal research and engagement in Bristol, working with the University and the City Council to approve the goals to Bristol's development. He's worked on the UK's first voluntary local review, which is something that we in Huddersfield will be moving towards. The VLR is a document submitted to the United Nations about the city's progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals that we mentioned. We've then got David Connor. David founded the 2030 Hub in Liverpool in 2016, so already 4 years into the project, to raise awareness of the SDG framework and share how it adds value to cities and businesses, social sectors, and of course individuals. So David's worked with local businesses and with the local authority to map progress towards that. We've then got, of course, Barry Shearman, who's MP for Huddersfield. I'm almost going to say that Barry needs no introduction, but I'm going to have a go anyway. So an MP since 1979, I believe. Barry's a passionate social entrepreneur, campaigner, champion of sustainability, equality, inclusion and innovation in our town. is one of the driving force, of course, the principal driving force, I would say, behind the Sustainable Huddersfield project. And then lastly, briefly, and certainly by no means least, we've got Bill Macbeth as well. Now, Bill is head of the Textile Centre of Excellence in Huddersfield, and will be explaining a little bit in more detail about our business and manufacturing working party. So without further ado, I'm going to move across to Beth Perry. Beth has a brief introduction, and then we'll move into her speech.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Barry, for inviting me to talk to you today. I've been asked just to give a very brief context to the Sustainable Development Goals and highlight some of the key benefits that there can be for different towns and cities in localising these international goals. And I know Chris has just done a great job of introducing these goals, but I was asked to assume that people may know a little bit, they may know nothing, and so I'll just give a very high level kind of overview. And Chris, please do stop me if I end up going on too far. So the Sustainable Development Goals were created with international governments and civil society and adopted in 2015 as part of the United Nations Agenda 2030. And the purpose of these goals was really to try and come up with a shared vision for improving quality of life and transforming environment and the way we live. And they actually replaced what was called the Millennium Development Goals, which previously really only applied to developing countries, or what we now often call the majority world, or lower and middle income countries. But the Sustainable Development Goals were different because they were intended to be a framework that applied to all of us across the globe. And as Chris said, there were 17 goals to end poverty, protect the planet and ensure prosperity for all. These are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals with the iconic colours that you can see here. And what's really interesting about these goals is that they really do exemplify how sustainable development isn't just about the environment. It isn't just about climate change. It isn't just about our natural resources, but it is also about poverty. It's about social justice. It's about economic justice. And I think that's one of the key ways in which the Sustainable Development Goals really can move us forward at a local level. So you can see the goals here. Goal number 1, no poverty. Goal number 2, zero hunger. And of course, goal 11, which is the one that says on the tin, sustainable cities and communities. So goal 11 is explicitly designed for cities and local authorities, but a lot of these other goals are really relevant. And local authorities really need to engage beyond just goal 11 to overcome what we sometimes call sectorsemia, where everyone's sat in their different policy silos without thinking about how these things interconnect. And you can see here on the right what the specific targets are for the Sustainable Development Goals under Goal 11, but there are many others that apply to how we think about sustainable communities. So in some of our work, we were working with Sheffield City Council to look at the relevance of the SDGs, and I know David and Allan are going to share much more in-depth examples of what they've been doing in their cities. But I thought it was worth just putting this up because we did exclude a few of the goals as being less relevant. And those were goals that were explicitly limited to developing or least developed countries. We didn't look at those things that were explicitly about laws and regulations or policies that were really in the responsibility of higher levels of government. And we didn't look at those sustainable development issues that are typically outside urban contexts like marine conservation. But nonetheless, of the 90 actual targets, which sit underneath the 17 goals, 53% were kind of assessed as being locally relevant to Sheffield, way beyond sustainable goal cities and communities in Goal 11. So I just want to highlight quickly that there's a real international flavour and appetite for progressing these sustainable development goals at the local level. And between 2015 and 2019, we were involved in a project in Malmö and Gothenburg in Sweden, with Cape Town, in South Africa, Buenos Aires, and also Shimla in India. And actually, a lot of these places are really taking this agenda seriously about localising the Sustainable Development Goals. In Kisumu, which actually also had devolution in 2014, they've been mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals in all of their plans. Malmo's been developing a 5-step strategy for how they're going to localise it, and that's informed the city budget itself. In Buenos Aires, in Cape Town, they were a part of the 100 Resilient City strategies, so that pre-existing context has shaped a bit how they're responding. And the City of Buenos Aires has also done the voluntary local review that Chris referred to at the beginning. And co-production as a strategy for engaging universities and policy actors and civil society has really focused people in concentrating on the SDGs, and that's been particularly successful in Buenos Aires around housing. And if I've just got a couple more minutes, I just wanted to say that in 2019, we had a workshop in partnership with stakeholders for sustainable development. And in fact, David, Connor and Allan Macloed both presented what was happening in Bristol and in Liverpool there. And we accompanied this with a series of interviews with Sheffield stakeholders. And we found on the one hand that there was a bit of, concern around the low profile of the SDGs compared with some of our international partners. The UK government hasn't been particularly supportive, either in terms of guidance or in terms of resources, about how local places would take this forward, lack of capacity and resource even before COVID. And we particularly found challenges around the fragmented data and strategic intelligence that places need. We can see that illustrated as well with the challenges around public health at the moment and who has the data that local places need to make decisions about themselves. But nonetheless, there were some real benefits for people of engaging with these goals. The SDGs were seen to offer a real shared vision, that they could connect citizens' concerns to policymakers, that they provided ways for universities and businesses and local authorities to work together, and that local businesses sometimes were leading the way, sometimes it's local authorities, or as you'll hear in the case of Bristol, sort of a very interesting partnership approach. So we found that places felt the SDGs were really useful to tell a local story that could be inspired by these global goals, to help them work together in partnership, to coordinate resources, especially under sort of the conditions of decades of austerity policies that we've had. People felt that the goals weren't perfect, but they were really useful for catalysing a discussion. And I think that's exactly what you've just said, Chris. And people did feel that we needed to be careful about SDG washing and just using them to claim something or represent something without really changing what we do. The real value of the SDGs is often seen in thinking across all the goals, not seeing them as a menu of options. But a lot of places were doing what Huddersfield has also done and picking the goals that really do speak best to their priorities. So just to conclude, and this will be the last slide, we found from our research that localising the SDGs really means making the goals the 4 Rs: real, relevant, relatable and relational. So they could be really transformative if the goals help local places like Huddersfield think about what's really locally important. How can they be mobilised to engage people beyond the usual suspects and really create a kind of public and citizen and civic campaign around transforming our places to be more sustainable? How can we make them real by really focusing on what can be practically done? And the most important one, I think, what are the relationships and coalitions needed to make this happen? Because the goals themselves can actually be quite transformative of how we organise our places. And this is what I'm quite interested in my research, is that the SDGs could potentially be really transformative in bringing people together across all these different sectors, and that delivering the SDGs is really about governance and about knowledge. And if we can build the kinds of partnerships that we need to take those things forward, then we'll be half the way there. So I'll stop there and hand back to Chris.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed, Beth. That was absolutely wonderful, and I've certainly learned a fair bit about what you've been doing down in Sheffield, and very, very, very interesting. So thank you for that. Everybody, what I will say is that apologies from Beth. Beth has to leave the discussion fairly promptly, so she won't be able to take any sort of questions from you as such. But what I will invite people to do is to use the chat function, please, if you can, to submit questions to our panel, if you're able and if you're inclined to do it, and we'll try and deal with those at the end if that's all right. So thank you once again, Beth. So now I'm going to move forward to Allan, if that's all right, who's going to talk, I think, about developing local sustainability and so on. So if you can unmute, Allan, if that's all right. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you, Chris. And just wanted to say a quick thank you to Barry and the team for convening this. It's always great to get to speak to others across the UK working on these issues and passionate about this work. As has already been mentioned, I work with the Bristol City office looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm going to take you through briefly some of the history around that, some of the work that we've done and how that's developed, and then some of the ways that we've sort of tried to practically make the SDGs relevant and take action as a city on some of these goals. So, the work in Bristol began through grassroots advocacy towards the end of our Green Capital year in 2015. As a city, we wanted to try and engage with the Sustainable Development Goals that had just recently been created and adopted. And so what happened was the formation of the SDG Alliance that we have. And that alliance then developed into a partnership within the city between the council, the University of Bristol and the Bristol Green Capital Partnership to try and think about how we could locally work on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's through the role that I do as the Research and Engagement Associate for the city. So on the one hand, it's working with an academic at the University of Bristol, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and how the localization efforts elsewhere can be applied to Bristol. But on the other hand, it's also working with engagement in the city, both within the City Council, but also with a wider network through the SDG Alliance. The Alliance was then supported, as I said, through my role and funded to try and support local stakeholders in understanding how they could use the SDGs. That point of how are these goals relevant? How is this international framework relevant to the city? How do we make it real to people in Bristol, as Beth was just saying? And it also became a role of embedded advocacy within the City Council, helping local authority stakeholders understand what the SDGs meant and understand what this framework was and how it could help. And the result of all that has been a great intake and an uptake in the use of the SDGs in Bristol. So as I mentioned about this SDG Alliance that we have, it's a cross-sector stakeholder network of well over 140 members now. I think that we're pushing nearly 170 on recent count, and it meets every 6 to 8 weeks. It's an informal network that is there to share best practice about the SDGs from the local level, from national counterparts, and also from international organisations, as well as providing opportunities for advocacy. It contains representatives from the City Council, from businesses, public sector, the universities, and from community groups as well. So it's a real range of organisations and individuals. And it's been one of the key advocacy tools for how we've developed greater interest and activity on the SDGs in Bristol. In terms of the work within the City Council, what we've been doing has been happening at the same time as conversations around wider governance within Bristol. So in 2019 we launched what was the One City Plan, and many of the activities within this One City Plan are directly relevant to the SDG targets. And so what we did was a similar piece of work to what Beth mentioned around mapping and understanding the relevance of the targets. We came out with slightly fewer targets relevant to Bristol based on some of that mapping exercise, but used some of the same benchmarks to understand which targets were relevant. We wanted to use the SDG targets and the framework as a way of understanding how we were progressing towards this long-term vision that we'd established in the One City Plan. And we wanted to use that as a way of monitoring how we were performing against the plan. Our One City Plan is a vision for the city to 2050, and it's structured around 6 themes: connectivity, economy, environment, health and well-being, homes and communities, and learning and skills, as you can see on the screen at the moment. And all of those are underpinned by our efforts towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So all of the work of these different boards is thinking about how they can deliver on the 17 goals, Each of the 6 themes has a board that's associated with them, with representatives from those sectors in the city. So our connectivity board has representatives from our local bus operators, as well as from some of our sustainable transport networks. Our economy board represents the culture sector, the shops and businesses, the Chamber of Commerce. All sorts of different stakeholders sit on those boards, and we work with those stakeholders to help them understand how to use both the Sustainable Development Goals, but also how to engage across the different boards so that we can be tackling these issues in a coherent way. As Beth was saying, it's a really important way of engaging between different sectors and de-siloing these issues so that we're not just working in individual challenges, but working across the piece throughout the city. It's already been mentioned, but Bristol undertook a voluntary local review as a result of some of this work, and that was funded by the University of Bristol in partnership with the City Office. It worked. It was one of the first voluntary local reviews to try and understand all 17 goals. So this was an approach that was developed by the City of New York to try and monitor their own work on the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we wanted to do in Bristol was understand what the full set of activity in the city was, not just on some of the specific priority goals, but on all of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we used data for over 140 indicators to provide a comprehensive baseline on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we consulted city partners as well, because we wanted to reflect the efforts of organisations in the city, not just the efforts of the City Council, which was something that's slightly different to what many cities around the world have done so far on voluntary local reviews. Most cities focus internally on what the City Councils can deliver. But actually, as a local authority in the UK, we don't necessarily hold the same levers of power as many other local authorities around the world. And so what we wanted to do was actually reflect the fact that we need to work in partnership to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. As was already mentioned, we were one of the first in the world to undertake this work. And we created a handbook that other local authorities in the UK can use to try and think about some of the data around this. And we're currently working with the Office for National Statistics to support other local authorities in engaging with the SDGs. In terms of the One City approach and the work on this, we're trying to make sure that going forward in the post-COVID world, we're using the SDGs as a key framework for our thinking, ensuring that our recovery is fair, healthy and sustainable, and that actually our structures and strategies are integrated and holistic so that we break down those silos. We want to make sure that fairness, health and sustainability, as well as inclusion, are at the core of our building back better. In terms of what this actually has meant, I'm going to go on to some of the sort of concrete tangibles with the last couple of minutes that I have left. You can see in the bottom left the voluntary local review, and there's a number of examples of activities that have occurred around the SDGs in that report. As I mentioned, about 90 organisations were profiled in that report. But I'm going to be focusing particularly on the Period Friendly Bristol work that we've done, as well as mentioning a few other activities. For example, we've had a Feeding Bristol pilot that was working to try and improve our engagement around food clubs and around food poverty in the city and tackling some of that, as well as working to improve the foster care offer and the number of foster parents and families that we had in the city. A lot of this has come through an approach that we have where we use these events called city gatherings. This is something that our Mayor Marvin Rees, uses to convene stakeholders. You can see a photo of the city gathering in the top left, which is taken from, I think that's from January 2019. And that was where we pulled together about 200 plus stakeholders in the room to discuss our progress towards some of those longer term visions and ideas for the city. From these city gatherings, one of the key things we try to do is use a model of offers and asks. What can you offer the city, and what are you asking from the city in terms of delivery? Big offer, big ask. And so I'll just scroll through some examples of what those are. But for example, here we've got one from the Living Wage City, working with the TUC in the Southwest to help Bristol become a living wage city. So the offer was that we could provide that, and the ask was that we wanted organisations to consider whether they would pledge to pay the living wage to their employees. Another is around foster care. We wanted Bristol to be a city where every child has a family that they can live with. And we wanted support for recruiting new foster carers. And that was about working with the HR departments of organisations to think about how their human resources policies could improve the foster care offer. I'll scroll through some of these a bit quicker so I can get onto one concrete tangible, but similar around Bristol Works and providing work experience, our energy provider that we have in the city, working with them to think about how organisations could use the sustainable energy that we have, and then also period poverty. This was a program that we ran in 2019 and is ongoing still in the city to try and improve the issue of period poverty and tackle this issue in Bristol. We came up with the development of a charity called Period Friendly Bristol, but it's something that we want to be using and replicating elsewhere. So actually there's a whole approach around period friendly places that we're working on as well to help roll this out in other locations. It was a real partnership approach from organisations across the city. We had large employers like Burgess Salmon, one of our large law firms, Hargreaves Lansdowne, an investment group in the city, as well as small community organisations from our Off the Record, who work with youth in the city, City to Sea, who think about sustainability and recycling, as well as then with some of the Government Equalities Office, the Department for Education, and some of our sports teams, so Bristol City Community Trust and the Community Trust for Bristol Rovers, two of the football teams, got really involved in this project. It was part education program to work with school children and get them engaging with the issues around the period dignity and period poverty in the city, and working with teachers to help the children and the whole system understand that this is a real issue for many people in the city. But it was also about providing period friendly points where people could pick up free period products and sanitary products for those who needed them. We worked with a number of organisations in the city to try and use open data to create a platform which could then allow people to either host a period-friendly box or to be able to find information. And we piloted this in some of our most deprived wards in the city so that people in those areas had easy access to these products. That's all I have to say on the sort of specific project side of things for Bristol. But I'm happy to take a few more questions towards the end about how we did this and any other questions you might have about the approach that we took in Bristol. But the idea behind our Sustainable Development Goals approach is one that it's all about the whole city. It's about the whole organisation and every organisation coming together to partner on this work. So I'll hand back to Chris, but thank you again for having me today and for hearing me speak about this.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed, Alan, and a tremendous snapshot there of the wonderful work that's going on in Bristol, and also a fabulous example of how you're working in partnership with a lot of private organisations. But you know, the killer point, of course, the real benefit that you are bringing to so many people in the community in the number of projects that you are providing and offering as well. So that's absolutely wonderful. I know that Beth has had to go, unfortunately, which we knew about and we fully understand. Do please keep the questions coming. We're getting to quite a lot coming through the chat function already, and we'll get onto those at a later stage, of course, as we get towards the end of this evening's presentation. So I'm going to move on to David now. And David is going to be talking, I think, about building local sustainability partnerships and so forth. So thank you very much indeed, David. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And hopefully the participants will enjoy the lack of PowerPoint. I don't know about you, I've had enough slides for one day. Alan, that was amazing. I'm always blown away by your presentations, and especially the speed. So I'll probably slow things down a little bit. Hello, everyone. I'm David from Liverpool, in case you couldn't tell by the accent. And yes, we have been doing this for nearly 5 years, actually, next February. But we've done it slightly differently in Liverpool. We took quite an independent approach, an apolitical approach, a slightly entrepreneurial approach. And it was a completely serendipitous start to that just happened to be in the right place at the right time. So 5 years ago, we could see the SDGs being launched, and especially with my background, more private sector. I've done a lot of work in the corporate and international CSR and sustainability world, working internationally and running some US communications companies. But prior to that, I did set up the charity at Everton Football Club. I am a Liverpool fan, for complete disclosure. And I also ended up managing the England amputee football team. And there's a whole set of stories about going through airport security with a bunch of amputees, but that's for another day. So we've come at it, and I've come at this from a slightly different perspective. It's not been really driven by academia. It's not really being driven by the public sector. In fact, it probably took us 4 years to get the public sector on board. And I think for me, the really important question with the SDGs is not what or how, it's more why. And especially given the journey that we've had that's included Brexit and austerity, asking anybody to embrace a whole new framework that is stereotypically about starving villages in Africa when you start talking about the UN. I think we can't underestimate the lack of awareness and understanding about this, and a lot of misinformation out there. So for 4 to 5 years, we have introduced the SDGs repetitively every day, and potentially honed. I know it sounds horrible, but almost a sales pitch. Why? And especially because we took an entrepreneurial approach from day one, and especially in Liverpool, there's a very strong social enterprise and third sector community, and especially because of the Objective 1 funding that we had for so long, there was a very strong funding dependency culture. So we set up as a limited company, a slightly different type of limited company, something called a B Corp, which we will get our certification finally very soon. And I can share lots of links, probably via the chat when I shut up. But we wanted to demonstrate that there was a almost self-sufficient, not dependent on funding nature to the SDGs, and also even within that learning from the MDGs to the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a very strong component that philanthropy in isolation wasn't the answer. It had to be a true multi-stakeholder approach, where, I should probably caveat this, I am a big believer that I think the private sector is responsible for a lot of those challenges over decades and centuries, and I absolutely think the private sector needs to step up. It needs help to step up. So that was a core part of our approach, and we knew if we could get local businesses involved, and look, let's be honest, the most businesses are SMEs, and most SMEs are not overly worried about poverty in Africa or even climate action in a lot of real world cases. But we knew if we could get the private sector on board and potentially wave a bit of a UN flag, that we might get the mayoral attention. So we set out to get a commitment from the mayor 4.5-5 years ago, and we finally got one recently. So our model was based around a city centre co-working space and a campaign that evolved around that. For me, cities in essence is mostly about people and groups of people and how we engage with them. And the SDGs are this wonderful silo busting framework that has this power to convene people and to get different people talking quite openly about impact and getting away from some of the buzzwords. Well, okay, you're a social enterprise, or you're a multinational, you're an SME, or a charity. Look, it doesn't matter. It's about poverty. It's about good health. It's about cities. It's about people and everybody taking responsibility. So our model evolved quite quickly. We very early on got recognition from something called Local 2030, or local2030.org if you want to visit the website. So we are officially the world's first UN recognized local hub, and have been for quite some time. We didn't know about it, they just told us. That project comes straight out of the Secretary General's office, and I think it's worth understanding that, at the hierarchy of the UN and globally, there's such a strong urbanization movement, and how the UN adapts to engaging not not nationally, because, you know, I think the UN's seen a couple of missteps with things like Brexit and Donald Trump, and not really assisting their initiatives in the UK or the US, but that emergence of mayors and cities as independent actors, and especially in the US, where a lot of mayors turned around to Donald Trump and said, hey, sorry, Donny, no, we're going to go with the scientists and we're going to honour the Paris Agreement. So the UN is really keen to try and develop that subnational engagement mechanism. So that's a lot of the ethos that we use to help refine our model. So bringing everything right up to speed. So it was 4.5 years of lots of introductions, and that's to LEPs, to mayors, to businesses, to national agencies, cross paths with Allan many times in New York, in OECD, Zoom meetings, etc. But it literally took us 4 years to get the mayor to go, okay. And in that point, I'll just be clear, we didn't have any funding. We took a Robin Hood model where we were helping private sector and selling desk space in a co-working space and eating pot noodles, because that's all we could afford, to eventually finding the right message to create that local ownership. And I'll be honest, I think you've got to understand that this can be as much about an international strategy for cities, when most cities don't have one. Even positioning exercises, and the value of the UN as a brand. You know, it is the world's biggest social impact brand, and, you know, for all those people out there trying to get engagement with senior managers or partners, look, there's a huge value there that absolutely has to be presented appropriately. But again, it is also a huge opportunity to help the why of the SDGs. Because for me, the reason that the City of Liverpool began to buy in, because it saw it as a way to build international relationships. Yes, absolutely, there's a potential efficiency or creating more impact with those furthest behind in Liverpool. And in Liverpool, 1 in 3 children is in poverty. We have rising infant mortality rates. We have some of the worst health inequalities in the country. Look, we've got some big problems. But it was some of that added value stuff that really got the buy-in. So we did the mapping piece of work a year ago. We also did a bit of a city competitor report, because cities like a bit of healthy competition. And if you can present your city, hey, well, you can be a leader, or maybe don't be at the bottom of the list is another way to approach that. That might be another way to help encourage some support and engagement. So we presented that list and some suggested SDG priorities, but, you know, we demanded that they were for wider consultation and not priorities that were guessed by a consultancy and then imposed on a city. The 3 key recommendations within that were: 1, the mayor needed to make a mayoral statement, and quite loudly, because the biggest problem with the SDGs is awareness. And not only awareness, it's then education. The second key recommendation was the city plan needed to be aligned with the SDGs, which was a challenge because the timing for us, the city plan had been done, but we forced it in right at the end. That took a little bit of work, but it's there. And then the third recommendation, or key recommendation, was to commit to a voluntary local review, which Allan and Beth have both mentioned. So we're just at the start of that. But I think even with our VLR approach, and again, probably typical Liverpool and a bit creative, it will be a bit different. It will be absolutely true multi-stakeholder engagement. It will be aligned with the city plan, but there'll also be a strong awareness raising, measurement and activation component. We will absolutely engage in the very creative side of our cultural community to potentially communicate that and to broaden that stakeholder engagement and reach. So for us, it's taken the essence of, look, yes, it is a framework that is data and targets and indicators, but making sure that it feels like Liverpool. It's the people of Liverpool have got to take ownership for this, and there may be a project around translating the main icons into Scouse, and we might get some kids to do that, and there might be a certain sense of humour involved in that. But that's really what we need to do. You know, a lot of the VLRs can start to look a little bit similar. It's the same goals, it's the same icons. For us, it is trying to take some of that data but creating a narrative alongside it, but for that narrative to be created by the people and the communities of the city. So for us, next year is going to be very interesting. We're racing to do a VLR, especially when there's a public sector spending freeze on, and the council can't spend any money, but we need to get it done by July. We have got a big business event in Liverpool called the Good Business Festival, which is an evolution of an international event that we've been holding. We've got big plans for Global Goals Week next September. We held a Global Goals Week campaign in Liverpool. We were one of 2 cities formerly with New York that took a bit of a comms approach to engagement. And for us, our shorter term target is COP26 and how we can take Liverpool on this SDG journey with COP26 as an opportunity, and an opportunity for this. I need to get this city to shine. Don't want to mispronounce that at COP26. But to be fair, from a climate perspective, we've got a lot of catching up to do. But Liverpool is quite good at being authentic and honest and saying, look, we haven't got this. We do have land, we do have sea. We're lucky in that respect. But next year is going to be a fascinating journey, and I think there will be a huge raising of awareness globally with the SDGs, and especially city level approaches. I can't overstate the opportunity for cities and towns and all territories to engage in that.
Fantastic, David, thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful insight into Liverpool and how you're actually how you're dealing with the SDGs on a local level as well. I think you're absolutely right that one of the things that we do need to consider is how to engage with our local stakeholders and how to localize the message as much as anything, of course, as well. Now we are running a little bit later, of course. We've had some fascinating speakers already, and I'm eager to move on to the chats, of course. What I'm proposing doing is maybe sort of extending by a few minutes if people are still comfortable with that, because we have some fabulous questions already coming through. So what I want to do is now move across to Barry, if I may, of course, who will give an overview of how the Sustainable Huddersfield project is moving forward and what our particular goals are and how it integrates into the locality and into the local community. So across to you, Barry.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I shall be very brief because what we want is more questions and more participation. And the last thing you want is a politician talking for too long. Can I first of all just say that the reason I think that Huddersfield's the right place to do the sort of thing we're doing, Sustainable Huddersfield, is because it drives people in Huddersfield mad if you say it's the average town in Britain. So I have to say the typical town in Britain. But we are. If you look at all the criteria, you know, the number of people, percentage of people working in manufacturing, you know, it's around about 10%. That's the national average. And number of people, the levels of poverty and also, you know, the distribution is the national average. If you look at almost all the criteria, we are a microcosm in terms of a population. Huddersfield in Kirklees is a representative. So it just seemed to me that I'd spent a lot of time in my social enterprise life, and you know, I've started, people tell me, well over 50 social enterprises, doing discrete, you know, campaigns about things. And it seemed to me so much of what I was doing needed a broader context in order to really to achieve. And when I stumbled across the Sustainable Development Goals, when I was working internationally on transport safety issues, actually, you know, when this crazy Swedish doctor said to me, what we need, Barry, we need to get endorsement of the United Nations. And I said, oh yeah, you know, really? And then years later, we get the Sustainable Development Goals, in which some of the things that I'm working on or have been working on fits in to a whole community approach. And that's what excites me about it. It's the whole community approach. So in Huddersfield, the microcosm of towns in Britain, a population that has a range of opinions. We've got the advantage of being a university town. I have to say that is a crucial element and the difference. And we are increasingly working with other university towns. We've just heard of the Bristol engagement. We've had a really good conversation with Oxford Zero and Cambridge Zero. And so, we started off saying, look, the Sustainable Development Goals actually are a discipline in which we work. It's not, we're not going to get shot if we go over, ignore one of the items or spend more time on one rather than the other. But overall, it's a great discipline for checking how we're doing. Are we making progress? Are we making progress in transport or energy or in homes and housing or health and well-being? It seems to me that if we're going to do it in Huddersfield, we need that broad support from business, from the voluntary sector, the charitable sector, from the university, from all the major players, but importantly from the citizens themselves. And that is why one of the first things we did when we got started was do a questionnaire where we could say, here are the Sustainable Development Goals, explain them in reasonably understandable language. Which ones do you prioritise in your community? Yes, what ones should we go for first? So we got that connection, I thought. And the other areas, I think, and I'll finish here, is that as a Member of Parliament, everyone talks about your wards. Now, I know 5 wards are important and that, there are lines on the map that show you where the councillors represent. And I have 5 wards in Huddersfield, but to my citizens, they don't mean, my residents, they don't mean that much. Someone in Mould Green doesn't think of himself as Dorton, and someone in Kirkheaton the same, where you can go round. I think there's 25 or 28 discernible communities which people feel committed to and loyal to. And it seems to me the Sustainable Development Goal must be able to reach down to those real communities rather than something that have been drawn on the electoral map. So my passion is, this isn't about sustainable towns, it's about sustainable communities, whether it's a little local community, whether it's a slightly bigger community, or whether it's the town or the town within the context of Kirklees. So in a sense, we want to take those barriers down, but realise what is out there. If we can get that really grassroots interest and involvement, I think we can do great things in terms of reaching some of the moving Huddersfield to be sustainable. And then I've started campaigning for this nationally, and on the basis people come in and say, what is this sustainable goal thing you're doing? And other people like Bristol, Liverpool and Sheffield are doing. And when you explain it and you say, look, if 50 towns would do it and then 500 towns would do it, then we're really making, and it isn't Greta Thunberg or it's not the United Nations up there, it is, we can roll up our sleeves locally and make a difference. It's an empowerment, not people this morning when they listened to the Secretary General of the United Nations saying, if you don't listen to this now, we're losing the planet. This is that urgent. But a lot of people need to know they can do local actions to meet that tremendous challenge. So all about grassroots, all about local involvement. Across party, I've seen no political advantage in this. All the parties must work together. I'm very pleased to see that there are other parties represented on the webinar tonight. Let's all work together. Let's come up with a unique product in Huddersfield and Kirklees. and think about it, that if we could then make sure that it reaches out to 500 and more communities, we can really make a difference.
Marvellous, and thank you very much indeed, Barry. As you say, you're sort of very much engaging on the grassroots level with our local communities and local groups, which is very, very important for the project to succeed, of course. And in fact, one of my jobs as the lead with the communications group, of course. Without further ado, I'm going to head across to Bill Macbeth from the Textile Centre to discuss a little bit more about sort of the business and manufacturing group, if I may, Bill.
Yeah, for sure. I'll only take a couple of minutes. Thanks, Chris. This is one of a number of working groups really looking at the role that businesses can play in progressing the sustainability objectives locally, and maybe establishing and using a new network to help businesses to access local advice, expertise, and financial support from existing programs. Working with the university, working with the LEP and the Combined Authority. We don't believe everything that we do has to be new. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's connecting it. That's the trick. Now, I'm organising this group along with Sue Cook, who runs the university's 3M Buckley Innovation Centre in Huddersfield, and Lisa Bristow from Cummins, great big American automotive company. The first meeting of our group happens next Thursday at 12:30. I'm producing now a very short paper outlining the context for it. Businesses, we're not going to talk a huge lot about high-level strategy or even particularly what other people are doing. I want to get agreement on a handful of early initiatives, which are pretty much tactical things. They're things that will be early, that will be real action, that will have a visible impact, and actually link in what's going on already. Things like creating a brokerage or a network to help companies locally to look at maybe downsizing. This is post-COVID. A lot of businesses are thinking, we're not going to bring everyone back. We don't need to. We don't need all the space we've got. My company is to say we work with 100 SMEs and some large companies, but how can we actually start to talk about, and the time is right, to share premises, to share resources, maybe to co-work and co-locate? How can we help companies to actually accelerate their take-up of digital technology? Absolutely crucial now. People have realized with the pandemic more than all of us have done for the last handful of decades on what digital technology can do to give you a new, faster, greener operation, particularly how you can revolutionize your supply chain. And there's a lot of help about that around now. Helping people with what's now being called green skills. This is going to be big around here. It's about awareness, and it's about knowledge, and it's about best practice. Much of these are business skills as well as normal human skills. We want to help people access grants for environmental improvements to their manufacturing operations. They're there. We've got to take away the bureaucracy and the hassle that prevents the majority of companies from going anywhere near them. And Barry and I are going to relaunch something we did 15 years ago called the Enterprise Foundation. This is letting companies know that if they want to start a business, there's a lot of help. There's public help. In those days, there was Business Link. But the real help is in the knowledge and the skills and the contacts of the existing businesses. And we had groups of existing business people helping other people to start new companies. We got them grants. We gave them training about how their lifestyle would have to change. The real core was getting a handful of mentors who could help them with practical things. All we did really was weed out the ones who were clinically insane, help them to do a really clear pitch, and then broker the arrangement with companies. So now we're going to have our new Enterprise Foundation, a new Dragon's Den for green companies, environmental companies. That's going to be great. We helped 69 people start companies in 1 year, and the vast majority of them are still around. And then finally, we've got a lovely place called the Stirling Community Farm, which is looking for somewhere to go. We think it can be a great, I went there with Chris. We were throwing ideas at them and they were visibly shrinking, but we think that could be a great hub, a great green environmental hub. I see a lot of traditional businesses there. I see pony trekking, it'd be great. I see a farrier, I see dry stone walling, where people start businesses. They get rent for free as long as they train people in the community to do the kind of things we're promoting. So that next meeting, that first meeting happens next Thursday, the 10th at 12:30. If people want to be part of that, just let the team here know. I'll send you the paper, we'll give those ideas, and we'd welcome some more ideas. We want to start doing things very quickly, very visibly, that people can see, hang on, I don't necessarily have to buy the whole package, but I fancy a bit of that. That's it.
Wonderful, marvelous. Thank you very much indeed, Bill, for that. And I think you've wonderfully and amazingly preempted our potential launch in the very near future of the Green Enterprise Foundation. So we're very, very pleased about that. And it's almost a case of, please everybody and all the participants and delegates that we've got this evening, watch this space to see what happens over the next few days. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move across to a few of the questions that we've had in. So, first question I've got on the chat here is actually from Sarah Newton to all the panelists, and Sarah's sort of asking if I can just try and pick it up. Here we are. What about enhancing protection for the environment in terms of revisiting housing and transport schemes and so on green belt locations and areas? So that's a question to everybody, you know, maybe sort of woodland and protection for existing trees and so on and so forth. Who wants to fire away with that one initially?
I can jump in briefly, yeah. In terms of what we've been up to in Bristol, we've been working quite closely between, as I mentioned, there's that structure that we got in place, which is quite helpful with the two different with the different sets of boards, and our environment board just recently launched an ecological emergency in response to the issues that many species are facing at the moment, and that's trying to tackle issues around pesticide, around waste, around biodiversity corridors. And so they're working quite closely with our other boards, and this is where the SDG agenda is quite helpful, because it helps the economy board that would normally think about one of our goals around goal 8, for example, around decent work and economic growth, and it gets them to think about how they can have an impact on some of these other goals around goal 15, life on land. So it helps tie together these different issues in one common area, and I think that's where adopting a framework like the SDGs really begins to bring together these issues that can often be siloed and separate, and bring them into one conversation so that you can deliver in a more integrated way. So it's from our end and from our experience, the framework itself is a really good way of beginning those conversations and getting that built into some of the local planning. And I picked up one of the other questions around earlier about how the SDGs have spread into a more regional challenge for Bristol, and that's something that we've been trying to work on recently with the West of England Combined Authority, about how we can integrate the SDGs into our spatial planning as well as into our city planning. So actually that gets into some of the more technical, slightly more boring local planning questions, but actually that's something we're looking to do, is embed the SDGs into the local planning, so that actually you bring together those issues of housing and those issues of environment in the same space and deliver them through the planning that you do.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Alan. Does anybody else want to jump in with that particular one? Any particular thoughts there? Okay, right. Well, I've got my next question here, which is from June Graham, and June's saying the SDG number 13 climate action goal. Is this where, and June actually localizes it as well. And hello, David. It looks like you've got a little an extra guest in your room. It's super to see. June's localizing her climate action question, saying, is this where Kirklees zero net carbon target by 2038 links into? And so are we able to use our SDG framework to help set the objectives locally with a net zero carbon target? And would it help if we're able to do that? I don't know who wants to pick up on that one, and maybe that's one perhaps for Barry.
I'm having a technology problem.
not to worry, Barry. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's something perhaps that David, you've experienced perhaps on a local level in Liverpool.
Yeah, Liverpool's always a challenge. I think from a net zero perspective, and I think touching on one of the other questions that was asked around climate emergencies, look, I'm with the person who asked that question. You know, that was the first opportunity for us when Liverpool declared its climate emergency to get the SDGs into the formal conversation. And again, like many cities, they made the declaration, and they're still working towards announcing the results of that and the carbon management plan and the carbon target. But I think in Liverpool, just like the SDGs, there is a really strong ambition, and there is a 2030 net zero carbon target. You know, I think Liverpool will be quite honest. They're not exactly sure how they're going to get to that, because it is, you know, it's a huge undertaking. And again, depends on how we define net zero. Is that the city council, the city council's operations? You know, there's always a lot of devil in the detail. But one of the things that we're currently working on is, again, it's using the SDGs and almost this sense of community, that for Liverpool to be a net zero carbon city by 2030, then in theory all the individual stakeholders, including individuals, also have to be net zero. From a 2030 hub perspective, we're looking to challenge the private sector and turn it into a bit of a competition and also a community, and let's see how quickly we can get to 100 and 1,000 or 10,000 businesses that have made that credible net zero commitment, and what data they're going to pick, and potentially looking at opportunities to build that into some procurement opportunities. And again, can we use this as part of a keeping business local? And again, a lot of it comes down to that convening power of the SDGs, and say, look, this isn't about individual businesses. It's not even about individual cities, but how we connect that climate conversation at a local level, you know, to SMEs, including hairdressers, pet shops, and website designers. How do we connect them to that climate emergency conversation? But we can do that at a local level. We can have conversations about, look, interrupted logistics because of roads that are flooded. I mean, potentially Liverpool is a slightly easier sell because we're on the coast. We're literally on the river. It might be a slightly easier communications thing for us. But again, I think it is this sense of community that comes with the SDGs, and it's not just the private sector, and it's not just the mayor. So look, as a city, we all have a role to play on this, and we can translate this into something that's locally relevant, and locally relevant each time it rains or there's a storm surge, and say, look, you know, this is what's going to happen and going to happen more frequently. So what can we do about it?
Marvelous stuff, David. Thank you very much indeed. It's always good to hear you know, the experience from somebody who's practically engaged in the issues, you know, so at the ground level as well. So that's very useful indeed. And I think because we're a little bit short of time, I'm just gonna offer one question, and this one originally is to yourself, Allan, but I'm not quite sure whether somebody else wants to, you know, so maybe become involved with it and pick it up as a subsequent when you've addressed it, Allan, if you may. This is from Gideon Richards, who's one of our team actually, and Gideon's saying to Allan, how did you get buy-in from having a full-time person running the coordination, and how did that work for you?
Well, so initially it was a part-time role. It was university funded. It was funded by some impact acceleration funding through the university to do some focused research. So there was other outputs and other tangibles that allowed that to happen. Then we began to work quite closely, and the mayor recognised, you know, kind of what David was saying about some of the international elements of it. For Bristol as a city, there was a real strong opportunity around the internationalization, but there was also a strong recognition that this was something that was important to people in Bristol. We had questions coming in, and we had we had briefings from the SDG Alliance to the mayor, and so there was a combination of the sort of invitations to some of the events that we were being invited to join, as well as then some of the advocacy from individuals within our SDG Alliance network that meant the mayor took this as something that was serious and something that within the city could provide a lot of opportunity. And I think there was also a recognition that this international agenda allows us to speak to the diversity of the city as well, but allows us to speak to local people about the issues that they're facing. So it speaks to some of our international elements within Bristol. We got a large diverse population, but it also allows us to speak to local people around the same challenges that they're facing. So there's a combination of both sides of that, as well as then the increasing engagement with businesses in this area meant that there was sort of support from the mayor to say, can we bring in a bit more resource? And that then brought in more support from the university. And it's been a bit of a patchwork in terms of funding for my role. We've had a variety of sources covering it. I've done odds and ends around the place to sort of keep the funding coming in. And I'm sure that's what David would say similarly for the 2030 Hub. I think they've had similar work around trying to keep the funding in place to keep the work afloat. And I think that is a challenge, and it's something we lobbied the national government on a number of times. There was a UK SSD, Stakeholders for Sustainable Development group, a local advocacy group that were meeting fairly regularly. And one of the things we regularly suggested of that group in terms of what they could be communicating to the national government was the opportunity to use focal points in cities and local authorities to actually help convene action around the SDGs and to convene activity. And I think that's what you find in cities where action has taken place, is willing participants or a little bit of resource to try and get action to take place. And it's frustrating that it does take that, but I think the political support helped us get that, and then we've had to sort of cobble together what we could to continue that work.
I think just on that point, Chris, I think it is worth understanding that every city is different, and the SDGs should be different in every city and every town. And it is trying to understand where the energy is and where those early adopters are, and getting them together first. And it doesn't really matter whether it's academia or if it's public sector led, or there's a private sector, or there's just a catalyst. Maybe one of the participants in the audience is just that natural catalyst within the city. And then once you get the right level of engagement, it sort of begins to create its own energy, and it's understanding what resources are available and working with the assets that you've got.
No, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Alan and David, on that. Now, as I say, sadly we're rapidly running out of time. In fact, we have sort of overshot, principally because we've had lots of wonderful questions coming in via the chat function, and also such fabulous guests and speakers as well. So thank you to everybody, one and all, for participating so fully and so wonderfully. We've not been able to address every question, of course, that's come through chat, but what we'll endeavour to do is to respond offline individually, if we may. And there are one or two very interesting points and questions sort of coming through, and issues potentially about getting involved as well. So one of the things that I'll say just very, very quickly is I think we've got a poll that's coming up very, very, very shortly. So if we can arrange to, and in fact here we are, it would appear to have come onto my splash screen here. So please, by all means, everybody, if you can please complete the poll, if that's all right, and we'll be looking at the responses in detail and acting upon those. It just sort of falls upon me as much as anything to say thank you again to our wonderful guests. Thank you to all the panelists, everyone who's participated, and to emphasise as much as anything, please do get involved with Sustainable Huddersfield. It's a wonderful initiative. It's fabulous. It will, we are hoping and expecting, really sort of bring the town to the forefront of sustainability. And sort of, I hate to say it in front of Alan and David, but certainly to rival, if not exceed, Bristol and Liverpool. We will see. So if we can do that, there are, I think, on the screen now, just a brief sort of screen grab of how to get involved with Sustainable Huddersfield. We've got our social media channels. We've got Twitter, of course, and Instagram down there. We've got our website, which is being updated on a regular basis, and will very, very shortly have a blog function on it as well. And also, we've got crucially our email there. So just to recap, we've got our working parties at the moment, which are very, very briefly business and manufacturing, and we've just heard from Bill, of course, environment, transport and energy, health and well-being, and mine, which is communications and culture. So by all means, please do think in detail about how you can possibly get involved with them. Please make contact with us through whichever of these channels. And thank you very much indeed for coming along, listening and participating in such detail. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.